When my wife told me that her new boss had changed and things were getting tough at work, I knew trouble was brewing. She'd always been capable, doing her job well and even handling responsibilities beyond her role. But this time, something felt different. One day, she came home visibly upset and told me how her boss had piled work on her for the entire department. It was unfair, and I could see she had reached her breaking point. She said she couldn't take it anymore, that she had tried to rally her coworkers to stand up to the boss. They had all decided to confront management, but somehow, she ended up taking most of the blame, and they fired her. She was devastated, but I tried to be as supportive as I could. This wasn't her fault, it was the reality of a toxic workplace. She barely finished telling me what had happened when her phone rang. It was her friend, a close one she used to work with. Turns out, her friend also left the company, fed up with the situation. They talked for a while, and I heard bits of their conversation. After she hung up, she looked a bit more relieved. I guess knowing her friend had also walked away made her feel less alone. I assured her that losing that job might be a blessing in disguise. No one should have to put up with being treated like that, and I was proud of her for standing her ground. It wasn't easy, and I knew that. For the next couple of weeks, we settled into a new routine. She focused on herself, took some time to decompress, and we tried not to dwell too much on the stress of her previous job. She spent time catching up with friends, meeting her old co-workers, and taking walks to clear her mind. It was good to see her laugh again, like when she met her friend for coffee. She deserved the time to reset. And then, one day, she came home, a bit excited. She said her friend had mentioned a job opening where she worked now. It wasn't something she knew much about, but her friend seemed to love it and thought it would be perfect for her as well. They offered me a meeting, she said. Her friend could arrange everything, she added, but there weren't many details yet. She didn't know what exactly the position entailed, but her friend spoke highly of the company. She mentioned how great the work environment was compared to what they'd dealt with before. Honestly, I was curious, but also cautious. It seemed like a lot was left up in the air, and I preferred to know what my wife was getting into before diving in headfirst. But seeing her smile again, I couldn't bring myself to question it too much. I asked her how they planned to handle the meeting if there were still so many unknowns. I was just being practical, I wanted her to be sure about what she was getting into. She shrugged and said that they were still ironing out the details, but her friend was confident that she could get her in. Apparently, the meeting was going to take place at her friend's home. That part struck me as a little unconventional, but I didn't say anything. I knew how badly my wife wanted to move forward after everything that happened, and maybe this was just how things were done nowadays. "Do you need me to help out with anything?" I asked. I thought maybe I could help her prepare, run through some potential interview questions, or even just help her with her resume if needed. She smiled and said it would be great if I could just give her a ride over there. I didn't mind at all. If it helped her feel more comfortable, I'd do it without hesitation. She seemed genuinely hopeful, and that was something I hadn't seen in a while. We agreed on a plan. The meeting was set for 6 p.m. in a couple of days. She would spend some time with her friend to figure out the specifics before then. We made sure her outfit was ready, and I reminded her that whatever happened, I was proud of her for moving forward. There was no shame in taking a step back and finding something that made her happier, even if it meant navigating some uncertainties. I drove my wife to her friend's place for the meeting. She was a bit nervous, but I could see the determination in her eyes. As we got closer, I tried to reassure her, saying that she just needed to be herself. Once we arrived, I dropped her off and watched as she went inside. I was about to drive away when my phone buzzed. It was her, asking me if I could bring her handbag. She had forgotten it at home, and apparently, it was something she really needed. Without a second thought, I agreed and turned the car around. On my way back to pick up the bag, I called my friend, mostly to pass the time. I told him about the situation and how my wife was going to have an interview at her friend's place. He paused for a second, and then said, "That sounds a bit odd, doesn't it?" I mean, an interview at someone's house? And she doesn't even know what the job is exactly? I brushed it off, telling him it was probably just an informal meeting. Besides, I was curious to see what kind of opportunity this was. My wife deserved a break, and if this job could offer her a better environment, then why not? I got back home, grabbed her bag, and headed back to her friend's house. As I approached the door, I knocked, and her friend answered, giving me a warm smile. She seemed genuinely appreciative that I came back. She invited me to come in while they were still discussing some things. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to step inside. I figured it wouldn't hurt to get a better sense of what was going on. The place was neat, and the atmosphere was friendly enough, though I still couldn't shake off what my friend had said earlier. Inside, I saw my wife sitting with two people, a man and a woman, both dressed in expensive-looking suits. They were chatting about the job, and I could tell my wife was trying to stay composed. The man introduced himself politely, and I returned the gesture. It felt a bit formal for a meeting at someone's house, but I kept my thoughts to myself. They were talking about how the job involved working directly with clients, face-to-face, in what they described as a comfortable office environment. It sounded decent enough, but the lack of specifics was still nagging at me. I decided to ask a bit more about what the job entailed. What kind of responsibilities will she have, exactly? I asked. The man gave a vague answer, saying that the details would be explained to her once she started working. They seemed confident that she would do well, and they wrapped up the conversation by saying, "Come in tomorrow, and we'll get you started." It was all very quick, and they sounded almost too eager to have her on board. I kept my face neutral, but something about the situation felt off to me. As they finished, the man and woman stood up, said their goodbyes, and left. I waited for them to leave before turning to my wife's friend. "So, what exactly are the duties?" I asked her directly. She smiled and said, "Oh, I'm just on reception. Your wife will be doing something else, but don't worry, it's nothing too complicated." I nodded, though I didn't feel any more reassured. I wasn't about to make a scene or question her friend too much. My wife seemed happy, and that was enough for now. After they wrapped up, my wife looked at me, and we decided it was time to head home. She seemed upbeat, and I didn't want to bring her down with my lingering doubts. As we walked out to the car, I couldn't help but feel like there were still too many unanswered questions. But for now, I kept those thoughts to myself. We got in the car, and I focused on the road, glancing over at her from time to time. She looked hopeful, and I wasn't going to take that away from her. We drove home quietly, with my wife filling me in on the little details of her conversation. She talked about the people she had just met and how nice they seemed. I nodded, listening to her, trying to be supportive. I decided I'd give it time and see how things played out. After we got home that evening, I couldn't help but voice my thoughts. It all seems a bit strange, doesn't it? The interview at someone's house, the vague answers about responsibilities, it just feels off, I said. My wife shrugged, clearly not sharing my concerns. "I think it's just the way things are done sometimes," she said. "Plus, I really wasn't expecting you to be there, maybe that's why they didn't say much. It wasn't exactly a planned formal interview." I nodded, though I still wasn't entirely convinced. "I get that," I replied, "but your friend invited me in, and I wasn't about to refuse." She gave a small smile and said, "It's okay, let's just see how it goes." With that, we both decided to let the conversation rest and called it a night. The next morning, we were up early, getting ready for her first day at the new job. I couldn't help but notice the dress she picked out. It was quite revealing, much more so than what she typically wore to work before. I raised an eyebrow and asked, "Why are you wearing something like that? Is it really necessary?" She sighed and gave me a matter-of-fact response. "You know how it is. People judge you by how you look. First impressions matter, and if looking a certain way makes my job easier, then I'm going to take advantage of that." I didn't have much to argue with there, though it didn't sit right with me. She added, "It worked in my old job, sometimes people treat you better if they think you're attractive. Maybe it means less work for me and the same pay. I watched her leave for work, and a part of me hoped that everything would go smoothly. She was determined, and I wanted to trust that her instincts were right. The day went by slowly as I kept myself busy with different tasks, but I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling in the back of my mind. When she finally came home that evening, she looked exhausted but had a satisfied look on her face. I asked her how her first day went, hoping for some reassurance. "It was good," she said. "The people there are nice. I'm working with 2 other girls, and we get along well." I nodded, feeling a bit of relief. But then she added something that made me raise an eyebrow. "You know, they actually made a comment about me not shaving my legs perfectly. Apparently, everything has to be flawless," she said with an annoyed smile. I couldn't believe it. "That's ridiculous," I said, shaking my head. "Why would that even matter?" She just shrugged, clearly unfazed. "It's part of the image, I guess," she said, and I let out a sigh. It all seemed so petty to me, but she didn't seem too bothered by it, so I decided to drop it. Later that evening, as we were winding down, I got a call from a few friends and some of my relatives. They wanted to get together and celebrate, maybe just have a nice evening with everyone. It had been a while since we all got together, and it seemed like a good opportunity to relax. I turned to my wife and said, "Looks like we've got a busy day tomorrow. First, we're going to visit my parents for a bit, and then we'll have some friends over here for a small get-together." She looked at me, a bit tired but smiling. "That sounds nice," she said, nodding. I could tell that she was still processing her first day, but she seemed willing to go along with the plan. Spending time with family and friends might be exactly what she needed to unwind after a long day at work. I could also use the distraction, maybe seeing everyone would take my mind off the strange feeling I still had about this job. Besides, I wanted her to have something positive to look forward to, something beyond work. We spent the rest of the evening discussing the details, what time we would leave, what to bring, and what to prepare for our friends. It felt good to have something else to focus on, something simple and familiar. I made sure everything was set for the next day, and we both settled in for the night, trying to relax. Despite everything, I still wanted her to feel supported, and I knew that showing her I cared about her work and our life together was important. Finally, as we were getting ready for bed, I asked her one last time, "You sure you're okay with everything? Tomorrow might be busy, but it should be fun." She smiled at me, a tired but genuine smile. "Yeah, I'm okay," she said. "I'm looking forward to it." With that, we agreed on our plans and turned in for the night. It was a small moment of normalcy, and I hoped it would be enough to keep us grounded amidst all the changes. We arrived at my parents' house around noon, and as soon as we walked in, the familiar scent of home-cooked food greeted us. My parents were thrilled to see us, and they wasted no time in ushering us to the table. Lunch was ready, and we all sat down to eat. The conversation started light, just the usual catching up, talking about what we'd been up to, and my parents filling us in on the latest family news. But it didn't take long before they turned their attention to my wife's new job. My parents had always been curious by nature, and while their questions often came from a place of love, they could sometimes be a bit much. As soon as they asked about her new job, I noticed a slight change in my wife's expression. She tried to keep a smile on her face, but I could tell she wasn't entirely comfortable. My parents, though, didn't seem to notice. My mom, especially, was the type who would dig until she got the answers she wanted. And once she sensed that my wife was being a bit evasive, it only fueled her curiosity more. "So, what exactly do you do there?" my mom asked, her eyes narrowing slightly in that way that showed she was genuinely intrigued. My wife hesitated for a moment before giving a brief answer. "I'm working with clients, just making sure everything goes smoothly for them," she said. But that wasn't enough for my mom. "What kind of clients? And what exactly do you help them with?" she pressed. My wife glanced at me for a moment, as if asking for help, but I knew my mom. The more we tried to avoid her questions, the more she would insist. My wife eventually said that her friend had helped her get the job, and she was working alongside 2 other girls, ensuring that clients' needs were met. My dad chimed in then, adding his own questions. So, do you handle any specific types of requests? Sounds like a pretty interesting job. My wife gave a polite smile and said, it's just making sure that everything the clients need is taken care of. I could tell she was trying to keep things vague, and my parents' relentless questioning wasn't helping. I wanted to step in, but I also knew that my parents wouldn't let it go until they felt like they had all the information they wanted. It was just how they were, and sometimes, it was easier to let them run out of steam. After what felt like an endless series of questions, my parents finally seemed satisfied, at least for the time being. We finished lunch, and my wife managed to shift the conversation to a different topic. We talked about upcoming family events, and my parents started sharing stories from when I was a kid. It felt like a bit of a reprieve, and I could see my wife visibly relaxing. Once we were done with lunch, we thanked my parents for the meal, and we got ready to head back home. On the way back, I glanced over at my wife. She was staring out the window, looking a bit tired. I decided to ask her directly. You seemed a little uncomfortable back there. Everything okay? She sighed and nodded. Yeah, it's just, we're not really supposed to talk much about the job. It's a company rule. That answer didn't exactly make me feel better, but I didn't push it. Why not? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She shrugged and said, that's just how it is. They want us to keep things private. Once we got home, we barely had time to settle in before our friends started arriving. We had planned this get-together earlier, and it seemed like everyone was eager to catch up. Just like my parents, our friends were curious about my wife's new job. They asked her how it was going, what her responsibilities were, and what kind of clients she worked with. I could see her giving the same vague answers she had given my parents. It's going well, and I'm working with a great team, she said, keeping it short and simple. After a while, the conversation shifted, and we were able to relax and enjoy the evening with our friends. We shared some drinks, laughed at old stories, and just enjoyed each other's company. It was a good distraction from everything else that had been on my mind. As the night wound down and our friends started to leave, I could see my wife looked a bit relieved that the questions were over. We said our goodbyes, and once we were alone, she let out a long breath. Well, at least that's over, she said with a small smile. I nodded, agreeing. It had been a long day, and I knew she was tired. As we started cleaning up, she mentioned something that caught my attention. You know, I think I'll be getting my first paycheck soon, well, at least an advance. It'll be nice to finally bring in some money again. I looked at her, seeing a bit of excitement in her eyes. I hoped this job would turn out to be what she wanted, and for now, that was enough. After everything that had happened over the last few days, my wife mentioned she was going to meet up with her friend after work. I thought it was good for her to get some time to relax and catch up, especially since she'd been so busy lately. As for me, a couple of my buddies invited me out for a drink, and I figured it was a good opportunity to unwind. I agreed and headed over to meet them at a local bar. It had been a while since we'd all gotten together, so it was nice to catch up, share a few laughs, and just enjoy the evening. We talked about all kinds of things, work, family, and the usual guy stuff. Eventually, one of the guys brought up something that caught everyone's attention. Hey, have you guys heard about that new place in town? It's supposed to be a spot where people can, have some intimacy service through a hole in the wall anonymously, he said, choosing his words carefully. It didn't take long for us to understand what he was hinting at. You mean like a secret club or something? One of the guys asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded, and we all exchanged looks. It was clear what kind of place he was talking about, something shady, like an underground establishment where men could, have their way with women through a hole in the wall, without any personal interaction. Another friend chimed in, curious about how he had heard of such a place. Where'd you even get that information from? He asked, half amused, half skeptical. A buddy of mine told me about it, he answered, shrugging. He said it's the kind of place for people who can't make things work in their own relationships, if you know what I mean. The guys started laughing and making jokes, saying none of us needed anything like that. It was all just guy talk, a way to kill time and share a laugh, but I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy about the whole thing. The idea of something like that existing in our town left a bad taste in my mouth. After a while, we moved on to other topics, finishing up our drinks before calling it a night. I said my goodbyes and headed home. As I drove, I found myself thinking about what my friends had said. When I got home, my wife was there, and I told her about the conversation we had. She frowned, clearly disgusted by the idea. "That's awful," she said, shaking her head. "Those places are demeaning, especially for the women involved. Even if someone offered me $1 million, I would never set foot in a place like that." I nodded, agreeing with her completely. "Of course, you wouldn't," I said, looking at her. "I wouldn't be able to handle being married to someone involved in something like that." She gave me a reassuring smile, and I could see that we were on the same page about it. It was good to know that we shared the same values. We both knew what kind of life we wanted, and it certainly didn't involve anything like what my friends had talked about. The conversation turned serious for a moment, but I could tell she wanted to change the mood, to move past such an unpleasant topic. After a brief silence, she brought up something different. "Oh, by the way," she said, her tone suddenly lighter, "since my friend and I have known each other for so long, we decided to get matching tattoos." That was something I didn't expect to hear. "Matching tattoos? Really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded, looking a bit excited. "Yeah, we thought it would be fun. Something small, just as a reminder of our friendship." I could tell she was excited about the idea, and I didn't want to dampen her enthusiasm. It wasn't something I would have ever thought of, but it seemed important to her. She then looked at me, her eyes hopeful. "Would you come with me? I mean, just to support me while I get it done." It wasn't a big ask, and I could see that it mattered to her. I paused for a moment, thinking it over. I wasn't really into the whole tattoo thing myself, but if it made her happy, I didn't see a reason to say no. "Sure," I said, giving her a small smile. "I'll come with you." She looked relieved, and her smile widened. The next day, we drove to the tattoo parlor. My wife and her friend had been talking about getting matching tattoos for a while now, and today was the day they finally decided to do it. As we walked in, the place had that familiar buzz of tattoo machines and the smell of antiseptic. They spent a good amount of time choosing the design, something small and unique that symbolized their friendship. After some discussion, they settled on a design that they both seemed excited about. I wasn't really one for tattoos myself, but I could see the enthusiasm on my wife's face, and I was glad to be there to support her. Once they decided on the design, they each took turns getting their tattoos done. While her friend was in the chair, my wife and I sat waiting. I figured it was a good opportunity to ask how things were going at her friend's work. "So, how's everything going with the new job?" I asked, trying to make some small talk while we waited. Her friend looked up from her phone and smiled. "Oh, everything's great. Your wife is doing amazing. She might even be Employee of the Month soon, the way she's going," she said, giving my wife a wink. I glanced over at my wife, who seemed a bit embarrassed but pleased by the compliment. When it was her turn to get the tattoo, I sat next to her, holding her hand for support. She looked calm and composed as the tattoo artist worked on her. I used the moment to ask more about her job. "So, what exactly do you do there again?" I asked. She smiled, looking at me while the needle buzzed against her skin. "We fulfill wishes, mostly for men," she said. "It's actually a pretty cool idea. Guys come in, they tell us what they want, and we help make it happen." I nodded, but I couldn't help feeling a bit confused. It seemed like every time she explained her work, there was something new. "Interesting," I said, keeping my thoughts to myself. I didn't want to dampen her mood, especially when she was excited about her new tattoo. After the tattoos were finished, we paid, thanked the artists, and left the shop. My wife and her friend were in good spirits, chatting and laughing about their new matching tattoos. As we got into the car, I couldn't help but think about what she had said. It seemed vague, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what bothered me about it. But seeing her so happy made me push those thoughts aside. She had worked hard, and she deserved to have something to smile about. We drove her friend home, and then we headed back to our place. Once we got home, my wife tossed her bag on the couch and headed to the bathroom to wash her hands. Just as she walked away, her phone started ringing. She called out to me, asking me to grab it for her. I picked up her bag to look for the phone, and that's when I noticed a small bottle of pills inside. They were birth control pills. I paused for a moment, not really sure what to make of it. When she came back, I handed her the phone, and she answered it quickly, walking away as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. After she hung up, I decided to ask her about it. "Hey, I saw those pills in your bag. What's going on?" She looked at me, a little taken aback, and then sighed. "I'm sorry I didn't mention it sooner," she said. "I've just gotten tired of using condoms. I was actually planning to bring it up tonight. We've been together for so long, and I thought it might be time to try something different. I know you're not interested in getting a vasectomy, so I figured birth control might be a good option." I listened to her explanation, and it made sense. She continued, "I didn't mean to keep it a secret. I was just waiting for the right moment to bring it up. I know it's a change, but I thought it might be something we could try." I nodded, thinking it over. She was right, we had been together for a long time, and maybe it was time to change things up a bit. I could see that she was genuinely trying to make things better for both of us, and I appreciated that she had taken the initiative. "Okay," I said finally, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine with it. Honestly, I'm all for anything that makes things easier for us." She looked relieved, and I could see the tension leave her shoulders. "Thanks for understanding," she said softly. I reached out and gave her a quick hug. "Of course," I replied. "I'm only happy if you are." And with that, the conversation was over. She seemed content, and I felt like we were on the same page. One day, one of my friends brought up something that caught me completely off guard. He mentioned my wife's new tattoo. "You know that tattoo your wife got?" He said, his tone casual but with a hint of something else. "Well, there's this guy I know who struggles with women, and he says he saw a tattoo just like that one at that place in town." I stared at him for a moment, confused. "What do you mean? What place?" I asked, my patience already wearing thin. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know, that shady place I told you about." He said he saw it on some woman's leg there. I could feel my stomach tightening as I processed what he was saying. I wasn't sure what to think. A tattoo like my wife's, at that kind of place? It didn't make any sense. I wanted to brush it off, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. The next day, my phone rang. It was the same friend, saying he could explain everything if I was willing to meet up. He even offered to show me the place if I wanted. I knew I couldn't ignore it, not with the doubt that was now nagging at me. We agreed to meet up at a bar later that evening so he could fill me in. When I arrived at the bar, he was already there, sitting with a strange grin on his face. Something about his expression irritated me. I sat down, and before I could even say anything, he spoke up. "All right, here's the deal. You give me $200, and I'll tell you exactly where that place is." I was stunned. "What? Are you serious right now?" I asked, barely able to contain my frustration. I glared at him, feeling my temper rising. "Who the hell do you think you are? You think you can shake me down like that?" He held up his hands defensively, clearly realizing he'd crossed a line. All right, he said quickly, trying to calm the situation. "No need to get angry. I'll show you the place, all right? Just chill." I kept my eyes on him, and he pulled out his phone, showing me a map with the location marked. "That's where it is," he said, pointing. "It's one of those places, you know, where guys can, anonymously do their thing through a wall. They say the women there make good money. The whole thing made me sick to my stomach, but I needed to know. I nodded, and we left the bar together, heading towards the address he had shown me. The drive was tense, and I didn't say much. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. When we finally arrived, the place looked just as shady as I had imagined. It was tucked away in an inconspicuous part of town, with a nondescript door and no obvious signs. We stepped out of the car, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My friend led the way, and we walked in. There, sitting at the reception desk, was my wife's friend. The look of surprise on her face when she saw me said it all. I approached her, my expression cold. "Where's my wife?" I asked, my voice low but firm. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "She's not here," she said quickly. "She works in the client services department, not here." I narrowed my eyes, not entirely convinced. I pushed past her, making my way further inside. The atmosphere was exactly what I had feared: dim lighting, strange sounds, and the kind of place that screamed secrecy. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I kept going. We moved through the hallway, and I could see the setup that my friend had described: small rooms with walls that had openings, the kind of place where anonymity was key. It was disgusting, and I hated every second of being there. But there was no sign of my wife. My friend followed me, a smug look on his face. "See? I wasn't making it up," he said, his voice filled with a mix of arrogance and self-satisfaction. I shot him a glare, my patience wearing thin. I didn't want to hear another word from him. I had seen enough. The place was exactly what he had described, but thankfully, there was no sign of my wife. I pushed him away, my frustration boiling over. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice filled with disgust. He shrugged, still wearing that annoying grin. "Told you," he muttered under his breath, but I didn't care. I shoved him out of the way and made my way to the exit. I needed to get out of there, away from that place and away from him. As we reached the car, I could feel my anger simmering just beneath the surface. My friend tried to make a joke, but I wasn't in the mood. "Just shut up," I snapped, opening the car door. I got in and slammed the door shut, starting the engine. I didn't even wait for him to get fully settled before I started driving. I needed to clear my head, to think about what all of this meant. But one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let him or anyone else get in my way. And with that, I drove off, leaving the place and all of its ugliness behind. When I got home that night, my wife was there waiting for me. She must have seen the look on my face because she immediately asked, "What did you want to know?" Her tone was guarded, and I could tell she was expecting something. I decided not to beat around the bush. "I know about the place," I said, keeping my voice steady. She paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I work there," she admitted, her expression unreadable. "But I'm in the client services department, not what you think." She continued, her voice turning defensive, "That's why I didn't want to tell you. And honestly, what does it matter where I work?" I tried to stay calm. I nodded, acting as if I was okay with her explanation. "All right," I said, keeping my voice neutral. But in my mind, alarms were going off. Something still didn't feel right. The way she spoke, the way she immediately jumped to defend herself, it all seemed rehearsed, like she had been preparing for this conversation. After our talk, she picked up her phone and started typing away. I watched her from the corner of my eye, trying not to let on that I was paying attention. It was clear she was messaging someone urgently, and it made my stomach turn. I had a growing sense that she was hiding more than she was letting on. Later that night, we went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I needed to know the truth. I waited until she had fallen asleep, her breathing slow and steady, before I carefully reached over to her side of the bed. I picked up her phone, trying to be as quiet as possible. But when I pressed the button, the screen lit up, and I saw the lock screen, a password I didn't know. I sighed, putting it back down gently. She had never used a password before, and that alone told me something had changed. I got out of bed, careful not to wake her, and made my way downstairs. There, in the closet, was an old, beat-up phone we hadn't used in years. I picked it up, dusting it off. It was barely functioning, with a cracked screen and a sluggish response time, but it might be my only chance. I turned it on, waiting as it slowly powered up. Once it was on, I navigated through the old apps, hoping that her account information might still be logged in. To my surprise, it was. I opened the messaging app, my heart pounding as I scrolled through the conversations. What I found made my stomach drop. There were messages between her and her friend, the same friend who worked at that place. They talked about how she had taken some time off, specifically so that if I started getting suspicious, she wouldn't be there when I checked. I read through the messages, my hands feeling numb. It was all planned. She knew I might come looking, and she had taken steps to make sure I wouldn't find anything. The realization hit me hard. She had been lying to me, covering her tracks, and using her friend to help her do it. I closed the app and sat there for a moment, trying to process everything. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of calm. It was like everything suddenly made sense. All the strange behavior, the secrecy, the defensive answers, it was all part of the act. I took a deep breath, putting the old phone back where I found it. I knew what I had to do. There was no coming back from this. The trust between us was gone, shattered by the lies and deceit. I went back upstairs, slipping into bed beside her as if nothing had happened. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. I lay there, staring at her in the dim light, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The woman lying next to me wasn't the person I thought she was. I had loved her, trusted her, and she had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. But I wasn't going to let that break me. I had a plan now, and I was going to see it through. The next morning, my wife got up and went about her usual routine. As she was getting ready, she mentioned she was heading out to work. I nodded, watching her closely as she gathered her things and left the house. The moment she walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had some things to take care of, and I needed her out of the house to do it. As soon as she was gone, I picked up my phone and called an attorney. I needed to get the ball rolling on the divorce, and I wanted everything prepared well in advance, without her knowledge. I explained my situation to the lawyer, and he understood the need for discretion. He assured me that he would start drafting the necessary paperwork and keep everything confidential until I was ready to move forward. It felt surreal, but it was also something that needed to be done. I wasn't going to stay in a marriage built on lies. Once I finished the call, I turned my attention to our finances. I wanted to make sure I protected what was mine before things got messy. I started by moving my personal savings to an account my wife had no access to, my parents' account. I transferred the funds carefully, making sure there was no way for her to track or reverse it. I needed my assets safe, away from her reach. I knew she might try to take what she could, especially considering the deception I discovered. Once the money was transferred, I felt a bit of reassurance, knowing that at least my savings were secure. But I wasn't done yet. There was more I needed to handle before I could feel fully prepared. I started searching the house, looking for anything else that might be of value, anything she might be hiding from me. It was during this search that I stumbled upon something unexpected. Behind the wardrobe, stuffed in the pocket of an old coat, was a large sum of cash. I pulled it out, staring at the stack of bills in disbelief. It was a significant amount, and I had no idea why she was hiding it there. My guess was that it was part of her salary, money she hadn't told me about, money she had kept for herself. I couldn't help but feel a wave of anger and disappointment. Even the finances, it seemed, were part of the web of lies she had spun around me. I knew what I had to do. I took the cash and decided to move it somewhere she wouldn't find it. I went to the garage and found a secure spot to stash it, making sure it was hidden well enough that she wouldn't stumble upon it by accident. If she thought she could deceive me and keep things from me, she was mistaken. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Once the cash was safely hidden, I took a moment to collect myself. It was a lot to process, but I knew I had to stay focused. There was no room for mistakes. Later that day, I made a call to my parents. I explained the situation to them, giving them a heads up that things might escalate soon. I also told them about the money I had transferred to their account and made it clear that they shouldn't touch it under any circumstances. They were supportive, as always, and promised to help in any way they could. Knowing that they were on my side gave me a sense of comfort, something I desperately needed at that moment. I knew I could rely on them, and that meant a lot. The day seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour as I waited for her to come home. When she finally did, I heard her car pull into the driveway. I took a deep breath, putting on my best neutral expression. I had to act like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. She walked in, gave me a small smile, and asked how my day had been. I smiled back, doing my best to keep my voice steady. "It was good," I said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "How was work?" She seemed tired, but she gave me a brief answer, telling me it had been a long day. I nodded, offering her some sympathy without pushing for too many details. I didn't want her to suspect anything was wrong, not yet. I watched as she headed to the bedroom, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. I followed her, making small talk to keep up the appearance of normalcy. She eventually went to bed, seemingly none the wiser about what I had been doing all day. A few weeks passed, and during that time, the divorce documents were finally ready. I picked them up from the lawyer's office and hid them in the garage, where they would be out of sight. That same evening, I checked the old phone again to see if there were any updates. Sure enough, I saw that my wife's vacation had come to an end, and she was expected back at work the next day. This was the opportunity one had been waiting for. I needed to catch her in the act, to put an end to this charade once and for all. The following day, my wife casually mentioned that she was heading over to her friend's place to catch up. I kept my expression neutral, pretending that everything was normal, but as soon as she left the house, I grabbed the divorce papers and headed out myself. I followed her from a distance, making sure to keep enough space between us so that she wouldn't notice. After a while, I saw her car pull up to the same building I had visited with my friend before, the one with the underground activities. She got out of the car and went inside. I parked my car down the street and waited. I knew that if I followed her in right away, it would look too suspicious, and I wanted to catch her off guard. I watched the entrance, counting the minutes. 30 minutes later, I got out of my car and walked towards the building. My heart was pounding, but I was determined to go through with it. I opened the door and stepped inside, immediately noticing the dim lighting and the same unsettling atmosphere as before. As soon as I entered, her friend jumped up from the reception desk, clearly startled by my presence. "We're closing," she said, her voice a bit too high-pitched. "You really shouldn't be here." I ignored her, my eyes scanning the room. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice cold and direct. Her friend stepped in front of me, trying to block my way. "You shouldn't be here," she repeated, this time adding, "especially considering you're married. How could you even think about coming to a place like this?" I didn't have time for her games. I pushed her aside, not roughly but firmly enough to make it clear that I wasn't going to be stopped. She stumbled back, giving me a look that was a mix of shock and fear. I walked further into the building, following the dimly lit hallway until I reached the area where I knew things took place. As I turned the corner, I saw exactly what I had feared. There was a long line of men, all waiting, their intentions clear. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep moving forward, my eyes scanning the scene for any sign of her. And then I saw it, a pair of legs sticking out from one of the openings in the wall, and on one ankle, the unmistakable tattoo that she had gotten with her friend. My heart sank, and a wave of cold rage washed over me. I pushed my way through the line, ignoring the protests and angry looks from the men waiting. They tried to shove back, but I didn't care. I was stronger, and my anger fueled me. I needed to get to her, to end this farce right here and now. Finally, I reached the opening. I could see her tattoo clearly, the proof of everything I had suspected. I pulled the divorce papers from my jacket, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the moment. Without hesitation, I pushed the papers through the opening, letting them fall at her feet on the other side. I didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. She had made her choices, and now I was making mine. With that, I turned around and started to walk away. The men in line looked at me, some of them angry, others just confused. I ignored them all, my focus entirely on getting out of that place. I pushed past them, not caring about the commotion I was causing. I just needed to leave, to get away from the filth and betrayal that surrounded me. I walked back out to my car, got in, and started the engine. I drove away, leaving everything behind, the lies, the deceit, and the woman who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. When I got back home, I was done pretending. I was done playing the part of the understanding husband. I went straight to our bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and started throwing her things into it. Clothes, shoes, anything that was hers, it all went into the suitcase without a second thought. I had just finished packing most of it when I heard her car pull into the driveway. She stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she yelled. "You had no right to interfere, no right to be there." I looked at her, my expression calm. "I had every right," I said. "I'm your husband. Or at least, I was. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." She shook her head, her eyes blazing with fury. "I'm not agreeing to a divorce," she spat, her voice trembling. "You can't just decide this on your own." I didn't even flinch. "I don't need your agreement," I replied coldly. "This is happening, whether you like it or not. You're leaving." I picked up the suitcase and walked past her, heading towards the door. She followed me, her voice rising in anger. "You can't do this," she shouted. I ignored her, stepping outside and heading towards the trash bin by the side of the house. I opened it and began tossing her things inside, one by one. Her face twisted in rage, and that's when I saw her reach for something on the kitchen counter. It was a knife. She grabbed it and pointed it at me, her hand shaking. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice almost a growl. "You'd better stop this right now, or you'll regret it." For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. I looked at her, really looked at her, and all I felt was a cold emptiness. I took a step forward, my voice steady. "Put it down," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated, but she didn't move. I knew I had to act quickly. I lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and twisting it just enough to make her drop the knife. She struggled, but I kept my grip firm, not hurting her but not letting her go either. I guided her backwards, towards the storage closet at the back of the hallway. She was yelling now, calling me every name she could think of, but I didn't care. I opened the closet door, pushed her inside, and closed it behind her, locking it. I could hear her pounding on the door, screaming, but I blocked it out. I needed to end this, to make sure she couldn't hurt me or herself any further. I pulled out my phone and called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. They arrived not long after, taking her away while she continued to shout and struggle. I watched silently as they put her in the back of the car and drove off. In the following weeks, the divorce process went surprisingly smoothly. The evidence I had gathered, combined with her behavior, made it clear that there was no saving this marriage. She didn't contest it, and soon enough, the papers were signed, and it was over. She didn't face any serious consequences for what she had done, but that was fine by me. I didn't want revenge, I just wanted her out of my life for good. A few weeks after everything was finalized, she showed up at my door. Her demeanor was completely different, gone was the anger and defiance. She looked almost pitiful, her eyes red from crying. She begged me to take her back, saying that after what had happened, she had lost her job and couldn't find another one. She promised that things would be different, that she would change. I listened, but I felt nothing. There was no going back, and I told her as much. I had given her all the chances I could, and she had thrown them away. After I turned her away, she tried to reach out to my parents, hoping they might convince me to take her back. But my parents knew everything that had happened, and they weren't about to side with her. They told her to leave, to not come back, and that was the end of it. She was gone from my life, and there was no part of me that wanted her back. I had finally closed that chapter, and I was ready to move on, without her and without the lies that had nearly destroyed me.